The first thing in Lab 1, we looked at identifying variables. So there's three main variables that I would like for you to be able to identify. The first is the dependent variable. And the question that you need to ask yourself when finding the dependent variable is what is being measured or observed in the experiment. So if you can remember that question, I like to find the dependent variable first. Then I like to find the independent variable. To ask yourself a question to find the independent variable, you ask yourself what is being changed or manipulated within the experiment, and therefore affects the dependent variable. And then lastly, controlled variables. You're looking at what stays the same throughout the experiment to make sure that we know that the independent variable, or the variable that's being changed, is the one that's actually affecting the dependent variable. Let's look at an example. Okay, so in an experiment, tomato plants are grown in pots in a greenhouse with differing amounts of nitrogen. There are several nutrients which are essential for growth of tomato plants, including nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and potassium. Tomato plants produce more tomatoes when grown in certain types of soils, which contain differing amounts of nutrients. There's a lot of verbiage there, right? But let's kind of pick out the dependent variable, the independent variable, and the controlled variables from the experiment. So the first thing we want to find is our dependent variable, and we're asking ourselves, what is being measured or what is being observed here? So in this experiment, we are measuring the growth of the tomato plants. We want to see effects of growth on the tomato plants. Now, the second thing we would find is the independent variable, and we ask ourselves, what is being changed or manipulated within the experiment? And here you can see that we're changing the amounts of nitrogen. So you're going to have a pot with a tomato plant that has a small amount of nitrogen. You're going to have a pot with a tomato plant with a medium amount of nitrogen, and you're going to have a pot of a tomato plant with a large amount of nitrogen. So you're going to look and see how the nitrogen, because that's what we're changing, right? That's our independent variable, is affecting our dependent variable, which is the growth of the tomato plant. And if we actually did this experiment, we would find that nitrogen does affect growth of a tomato plant, and the large amount of nitrogen would actually help with the growth of the tomato plant. But to make sure that it's the nitrogen that's affecting the growth of the tomato plant, we would want to have some controlled variables. So our controlled variables, remember, are those variables that are staying the same throughout the experiment. So here, we want to make sure that we're not changing the amount of phosphorus, iron, and potassium in the soil of all of the pots, right? We don't want, in the small amount of nitrogen pot, we don't want a large amount of phosphorus. And then in the medium pot, we want both medium amounts. You wouldn't know which it's the phosphorus or the nitrogen affecting the growth, right? So you want all of those nutrients to stay the same. You also want the size of the pot to stay the same. That might affect growth. Other things that might affect growth of the tomato plant would also be sunlight. So you want each plant to get the same amount of sunlight, and you also want each plant to get the same amount of water, because those factors could also affect growth. So those are just some things that size of the pot, amount of water and sunlight, and making sure all the other nutrients would stay the same. And those are your control variables. Okay, so let's talk about how to graph the data. The first thing that you want to do is make sure you can identify the dependent and independent variables. Then you need to remember that the dependent variable always goes on the y-axis. The y-axis is the vertical axis. The x-axis is the horizontal axis. You can kind of remember that by, I think, about the horizon, or and if you look out at the horizon, you're kind of be looking at it like an x-axis, if you will. And then the vertical axis is the y-axis. So the dependent variable always goes on the y-axis. The independent variable always goes on the x-axis. So it's really important that you can identify those variables and then also put them on the correct axis. The step 4 is then to determine whether you need a line graph or a bar graph. So we generally use bar graphs for most of the data that we are going to do in this course, except for any data where we show a change over time. So if we were looking at evolution from generation to generation, for example, or the change in growth over time, or we were looking at the amount of hatchlings for your brine shrimp, for example, over a number of days, you would want to put that, because it's over time, in the form of a line graph. And then number 5, you need to draw your graph, and you need to remember a couple of things. Number 1, which one's the x and y axis? That's good. And then also you need to make sure that you have x and y axis titles. So tell me what is on the x axis and what is on the y axis. What am I looking at? So for the last experiment, we would have on our y-axis, our dependent variable would be the growth of the tomato plant. That would be my y-axis title. For the x-axis, the title would be differing amounts of nitrogen. Also, don't forget where 0 is on your graph. So where the y-axis and the x-axis meet, that will be 0. So make sure that you know whenever you're graphing your data that you put it in sequence or in reference to 0 when you're graphing your data. You also will need to make sure that you know what a key is for a graph. So keys are very important so that you can distinguish different bars from each other, or different lines if it's a line graph. So make sure that you feel comfortable with a key. What I would do is probably just go Google some examples of graphs. That's what I would do, and look at those keys. Make sure that you also include units when you're looking at a graph or creating a graph. So for the growth of the plant, maybe we're measuring the growth of the plant in centimeters. So you would want to write centimeters out in parentheses beside growth of the tomato plant. Growth of the tomato plant would be your y-axis title. Your units would be centimeters. If it's temperature, it's degrees Celsius for your units. Just something to keep in mind.